This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with their most important stakeholders. In a very first for the show, today we are so fortunate to have the powerhouse father-daughter combination of Bill and Emma Dauster with us to share their insights and expertise in public policy, and science communication. Bill is a university lecturer and lawyer, economist, and speechwriter who served on the United States Senate and White House staffs from 1986 to 2017. On February 12, 2020, President Trump nominated Bill to be the Democratic public trustee on the Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund boards of trustees. Bill's professional specialties are fiscal policy, Senate procedures, and speechwriting. He is currently teaching in the University of Pennsylvania's program in Washington about the balance of power between Congress and the president. Bill also is an adjunct professor at American University, where he's taught on congressional procedure at the Washington College of Law. Bill served in multiple leadership roles for the U.S. Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid, including Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Assistant to the Leader for Floor Operations. And previous to those positions, Bill was Deputy Staff Director and General Counsel for the U.S. Senate's Finance Committee, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the White House, among many other senior roles in the U.S. Senate. Bill earned his JD from Columbia University and both his Master's in Economics and BA in International Relations and Politics from USC. And Emma Dauster is a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her research focuses on sex differences in the neural regulation of attention. Emma's objective is to develop more effective and personalized medicine through her research on norepinephrine's role in attention. She also has extensive science communication experience working with the That's Life Science blog, the Life Science Cafe, Letters to a Pre-Scientist, and also local grade school visits, as well as Skype a Scientist and STEM Ambassadors Program, among many others. Prior to her PhD work, Emma was an undergraduate research assistant at Case Western Reserve University, where she earned her bachelor's in biology and also did summer research work at NIH on diabetes and kidney diseases. Welcome to the show, Bill and Emma.
Thanks for having us.
It is great to have both of you on the show. You bring such important insights, and I'm really eager to get to the question. So I'm going to start with Emma first with a question about science communication. And I'm just wondering, Emma, as you go through your program and do your research, if you find there is much interest in the areas of policy and science and government among your peers who are earning STEM PhDs, for example.
Well, thank you for having us. First of all, we're very excited to be here, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I want to start off by saying that a lot of my friends who are also pursuing PhDs in STEM programs are interested in policy making and government in addition to their STEM pursuits. So maybe a fourth of my peers getting STEM PhDs are very interested in everything that my dad's going to talk about.
Great. That is great. And let me ask you, do you have any thoughts on why that is? Why they're interested? Like if, what may have sparked that, or what in particular they're thinking about?
Well, I think their politics is related to everything that we do. And when you start really diving into research and looking into the undiscovered of life, there's a lot of politics that actually intervenes and makes it so that in order to do that work, you need to also have a good relationship with the policies
Mhm.
in hand. You have there's a lot that goes into the science before you get to do the science. So
Mhm.
some people are interested in what needs to happen before the science can even be done.
Really interesting. Thanks for underlining that too. Bill, just from your perspective first, you've been on the receiving end of so many messages from scientists to policymakers who are, interested in talking about their research priorities and potentially seeking government funding for them, for example. And I'm wondering if you can think to your experience there and which approaches that you've found scientists employing that were particularly effective in getting their message across to politicians.
Well, one of the things we have to think about, and you'll know this, Mark, from having been a chief of staff for a senator, is you have to think from the senator's point of view, what is their scarcest resource?
Mm.
And the thing that they have the least of is time. So they want people to come in and tell them what they need to know and get to the point and communicate quickly and effectively. The other thing that is useful as if you're trying to influence policy in Washington is to make sure you're going to the right person.
Mhm.
Make sure that you're going to the staffer who has the senator's ear on this subject, or you're going to the senator's office that can most affect the policy you're trying to change.
So important. It's interesting too, kind of thinking about Emma's response saying, some are interested, and I know Emma has got a lot of expertise. Some are interested in the policy that has to happen before the science. And some of what your message seems to be is, the scientist in a policymaking environment or wanting to influence policymakers needs to do a little research before even thinking about what they're going to say.
Yep, that's for sure.
And kind of along those lines, Bill, from where your perspective and your insights, how do you see the difference between, say, convincing a scientific advisor versus a politician that your research is important?
Well, a scientific advisor might be, and Emma might talk to this after I'm done, but
Mhm.
might be more concerned with what's new and interesting science, what could be published. The politician will be interested in what he can or she can do to affect public policy. So the politician is going to be more practically oriented. There are some things that the senator will know that the senator just can't change, and so the
Mhm.
senator won't be as interested in that, even if there is compelling and scientific reason to be thinking about that subject.
Mhm.
Did you
Mhm.
want to
Yeah,
weigh in on
please.
that one?
Yeah, so I love that you brought up the idea of making your message digestible because people are very busy. Because that was one of the main points that I was thinking when you're talking to either your advisor or a politician. You're going to need to be aware that they have many other things floating around in their mind. They have many other obligations that they need to run off to. So if you can make it as succinct and digestible as possible when you're talking to them about your research, then you're really going to get the most out of that conversation. I think that there's a lot of similarities between those two conversations that you would be having. Both of these people are interested in how to make the next paycheck, which I know is not something that we really want to talk about, but if you can convince them that what you're researching is going to be fundable and is something that they should really be putting their money toward,
Mhm.
then that's going to be something that they should pay attention to. I mean, a difference would be that the advisor should have some kind of benefit to their own career if you can produce some valid research finding from your investigations. So there's kind of an intrinsic benefit to your advisor when they're listening to your proposals. But a politician also wants to help their constituents. So there is, if you can express to them that you are going to benefit the world and make it a better place for people to inhabit with whatever research you're doing, then they should be pretty receptive, I would think.
Just it's so interesting. First of all, highlighting this need to be succinct. I just think of the famous quote, "If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." It's not easy to do that necessarily, and sometimes maybe there's an underappreciation for the skill that it requires to figure out just what to convey. I mean, Emma, in your case, you're an expert, and there's so many things you could say about your science, and so but you have to kind of pick and choose the best way, the best information to convey, and as you point out, kind of targeted towards why it's in the politician's interest or the district or state's interest to support it. That's a real skill that takes some development.
For sure. And depending on your audience, that's going to be a different thing that you pull out of what you're working on to talk about.
Yeah, I want to follow up, Emma, and ask you how your science background informs your views on politics and how your upbringing, maybe surrounded by the political process, influences your scientific approach, if it does that at all.
Yeah, so I grew up outside of DC in Maryland, and both of my parents are involved in government. It felt like everyone around me growing up was commuting into DC and working on the Hill. So, there was a lot of awareness about, the kind of argumentative nature of politics and how people can really become very set in their views. And what I wanted in turning to science was to discover truths, so that it's less argumentative, it's more factual, it's more concrete. And it turns out that science has a lot of similarities with politics, and there is still a lot of stubbornness and a lot of arguments about which, when there's conflicting findings, what do you believe is true? And that word, we can use in quotations. But I think that we as scientists bring our own biases into every question that we choose to investigate. So there's a lot of bias in both factors. And so, being trained in biology, it's very clear to me that not everybody fact checks information when we're discussing politics. I think that when people do fact check their information, right now we're living in a time when there's so many different ways to get your information from so many different places, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So it is very easy to have conflicting evidence, even when you're not basing it on science. So I'm glad that the senators have staffers, is the bottom line, that can look into where the evidence is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's become increasingly difficult and important, as you know. Bill, I want to ask you first, many listeners are interested in science policy, as Emma, kind of related from her own colleagues, interested in getting involved in policymaking, for example. And when you were working in the Senate, you interacted a lot with scientists who were involved, supervised, encountered these scientists, whether social scientists or natural scientists. And I'm wondering if you could share with listeners who are interested in getting involved in government on one level or the other, what qualities and skills did you find effective scientist staffers had in common or seemed to possess?
And it's true, Mark. You and I both know many staffers who have that hidden doctorate in chemistry that they never tell anybody about. And then they end up being perfectly successful staffers anyway. But sometimes it does take a little bit of culture adjustment. For example, we tend to want to have our written product turned around in pretty short order if the senator wants it. If the senator asks for something, we can't take several days on the project. We turn around and get the best possible product in a day or by the end of the day when the senator has to leave the office. And that memo can't be the definitive 15-page dissertation on why this thing will or will not work. The senator will not read past the first page oftentimes. So you have to learn how to put the important stuff at the top of the memo. And sometimes Emma's good at this in her work. Write something at the top that draws the reader in to read the rest of the memo.
Well,
And
Emma,
finally,
go ahead, Bill.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Finally, there is a difference that takes sometimes takes some getting used to, that when the constituent comes in to see the staffer, the constituent is king. So you have to make sure that the constituent doesn't leave the senator's office thinking, gee, I don't know why the senator doesn't hire people who aren't capable of talking to me about this and that.
For sure. And I want to just ask Emma this question because you've raised it, Bill. I've come across this many times, and it is a natural inclination when writing or even when speaking to sort of want to proceed in a logical way. This happened, and then I drew this conclusion, and then I went to that interim finding, and then finally, here is the punchline. But that's really the opposite of what you need to be doing in a policymaking world. And Emma, I'd like to, as a scientist who's involved in science policy and talking to scientists, talking to policymakers among other non-experts, how do you handle that maybe urge to proceed in a logical way, so to speak, while understanding that, look, that's just not the way it works here?
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but there is a secret about research, and that is that when we publish our findings, we make it sound very logical. And of course, we found this, and that led us to find that, and that led us to find that, and here's your perfect, wrapped up, neat and tidy response of how this all works. But a lot of times that's not actually how the investigations happen, and we just need to figure out how to explain our findings in a way that makes sense in the context of what we know about how everything functions together. So I think that we are practiced in an illogical kind of way to explain what we do, but we are trained to make it sound very linear.
So think non-linearly. I guess it's almost like a backwards presentation with the punchline and then the joke.
Right. And we have, we put an abstract at the beginning, so we'll do something similar to what my dad was talking about for ourselves.
That's really helpful advice, very specific advice when talking to policymakers. Think about the abstract of your thesis or your study that you're working on, and think about that level of detail, perhaps.
Yeah.
Great. Bill, I want to ask you first, what your views are about the best entry points for scientists who want to get into the policy arena, some of whether, local, state, federal, legislative branch versus executive branch, for example. It can be very confusing. There doesn't really seem to be an organized recruitment process in many cases when you're talking about going to work for government. Sure, there are websites, but those don't always really produce much result. And so you have this real interest, and some people are just frustrated because they can't figure out a way in.
That's a very good point, Mark. And you and I know, both of us have been hiring officials, that there are roughly 700 hiring or 750 hiring officials on Capitol Hill alone. Each senator, each congressman has a hiring official or is the hiring official. Then there are committees, 200 committees or subcommittees, each of which is a hiring official on its own. And there's very little coordination, centralization of the hiring process. So not just scientists, but all sorts of folks can feel very frustrated trying to get into that system. And it often requires acting like a Google search engine and iterating out, contacting lots of different places, and then moving from that place to another place, networking out your contacts to try and get in touch with people. Luckily, there are a few programs that create fellowships for scientists and engineers. The AAAS does a fellowship program, and their website lists 30 other fellowship programs that are like theirs or coordinated with them. And that is a good means of entry into Washington, D.C., and I understand into state governments more and more too. That works both for legislative offices and for executive branch offices. I've seen AAAS fellows in both types of places. On the federal versus state, that one you're seeing a lot more action on a state level now, increasingly. So I think that people should think about opportunities on the state level as much as on the federal level too.
Absolutely. And I can just say from personal experience, even on the county level, so the local level, when I left the Hill, I had more time out of the office or not talking on my iPhone. And I got involved in a school board issue that was happening in my county. And there were PhDs who were sort of part of our informal working group. And I really felt that kind of entry point could be a great way for scientists or engineers, really anybody, but we're talking mostly about scientists and engineers for our purposes here, to get involved. It's a very low, barrier to entry. You're talking with your neighbors, but you're also intervening or you're interacting with county officials. We were talking to the school board members and the county board members, and it gave the PhDs in our group really a good sense of how policymaking can work, that they perhaps might want to apply in whether local or federal or state settings as well. When most people think of diversity, and this one is actually for Emma to start, most people think of diversity and representation in Congress. We talk about that issue, but is it important to have diversity in research as well? And assuming the question is absolutely yes, why is that?
Well, this is one of my favorite questions. Thank you so much for asking. My dad actually brought up fellowships, which when Congress decides to allocate funding toward research, then the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, these organizations get to decide who to allocate that funding to. And there are a lot more initiatives these days to try to give that money to a more diverse population so that it's not just the same people over and over again. But going into why you would want to do that, because now I've mentioned that Congress does play a role in who gets to do their research, but why do we care? Well, when I first started research in a neuroscience lab, my first experience in research was working with cells. So this doesn't really apply to that. But when I started working in neuroscience, I was working with rodents. And rodents have sexes. So there's male and female, which is why it doesn't apply to cells as much. But I just assumed that all of the research would be conducted on both male and female rodents. And then I found out once I started working there that they only conducted research in male rodents in this particular lab. And I was a little bit confused about that. I kind of scratched my head and said, why would that be the case? And it turns out that historically, people just did not think that the fluctuations in hormones and the variability in behavioral outcome that you would get from females were worth it to investigate. So they decided to just stick to investigating males because they're not as variable generally. And, most of the researchers who were getting funding were males. So it just made sense to them. And they really excluded a huge population, assuming that the brain would be exactly the same, the behavior would be exactly the same. Fast forward, there are many more female scientists today who are well-funded and doing amazing research. And they're finding that there are sex differences in the brain that are related to sex differences in behavior. And that could be a huge lack in our fundamental understanding of how the brain works, that we're not doing these comparative studies because people just weren't thinking about it, because there weren't people bringing their own perspectives from a variety of different backgrounds into this research. So that was just one anecdote that thankfully is definitely improving. There are now recommendations that when you submit a proposal for funding to the National Institutes of Health, you need to explain why you're not using females if you are not using females in your study, because people are realizing that this is important. But the bottom line is that this extends far beyond sexes, and it goes into ability and ethnicity, and there's so many different what I was talking about earlier with the biases that scientists bring into their own research. You ask questions that you think of, and maybe with a greater diversity of researchers, we would have a greater diversity of questions that are being asked, and that ultimately will benefit a large portion of the world that is not currently being benefited by a lot of the basic research that is the foundation of treatments for different disorders.
Right. So true. And we're, of course, seeing evidence of that in various communities now. Bill, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I do. One of the things I've done since I've left government is take classes at the University of Maryland in biblical studies. And it's funny how even there, the presence or the lack of women researchers led to different results. So when they first discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, people keep reading them as only involving males. And then when women's researchers started to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they all of a sudden noticed that some of the scrolls talk about women. And that had just been lost on some of the researchers that had been looking at it before then. Also, as a lecturer, as a college lecturer, I've noticed this, and a lot of scientists probably notice this if they teach too, but the population in college has been changing. Women became a majority of college students in the 70s, but by 2026, the government projects women will account for 57% of college students. And the future of college students is also diverse. For people in the 18 to 29 age group, non-white minorities outnumber whites starting in 2027. And for people under age 18, minorities already outnumber whites this year. And minority populations have accounted for most of U.S. births since 2012. So if we want to be teaching people, we want to react to the population that we're teaching as well.
For sure. And, these blind spots that have been passed down from generation to generation because of the homogeneity of researchers and decision makers, have real consequences. So, I think that, clearly diversity has a value in society in and of itself, but it also has a very important value across sectors. And whether you're looking, you're on a board of directors looking at a particular product or service, that your company is launching, you need all the perspectives in the room to really make sure you don't miss anything, or you take advantage of all the opportunities, and it really filters down, through science and through policy making. So thanks for both of you for bringing that perspective, to what we're talking about right now. And I'm just going to pause the recording for a second because my dog wants to get up on the recliner in my office. And though she
As your dog will.
It's just, she can do it herself, but she prefers to have someone do it for her. It's ridiculous. She is spoiled. Yeah, we prefer the term pampered, but she is terribly. But we've had her since 11 weeks, so she's She is pretty
Still a
funny.
little one.
Yeah, she is funny. All right. No, that was great. Let me get back to here. Okay, perfect. All right. Um, so now I'd like to start with Emma on this question. This is something that I encounter a lot in my work with scientists and engineers. Scientists are trained to really follow the data, so to speak, but public policies are shaped by, they're embedded with political considerations like the equity of a proposal, not just how efficient that proposal may be, or the power of certain groups. And of course, Bill's been in the middle of these types of decisions and assessments. The power of certain groups in society to get their voices heard, and that can be reflected in policy as well. So when you think about scientists getting involved in policymaking, Emma, I'm wondering if this kind of dynamic can be a challenge for scientists interested in getting into government, because it's just not all about the data when you talk about the political realm.
I think that scientists can do whatever they want to do, but following the data is kind of an interesting concept. You definitely do follow the data in your research, but there is a lot of politics that goes into what you're investigating. So right now, there's a lot of money going toward autism and Alzheimer's research, for example. These are two things that the public is very interested in. And so that's what's being funded. And the public tells their representatives, and the representatives tell the National Institutes of Health or whoever. But, you do the research that you get paid to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a way that there's a lot of people, because something like autism is such a spectrum and there's so many comorbidities. So there's a lot to unpack in autism. And that's why a lot of people are finding success in getting funded for following their own data, but now it is applicable to this new thing that we never, were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
So we are flexible people in that way, and I think that we can adapt.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it would be instructive to scientists who aren't accustomed to thinking this way, that, some of that same circumstance is also active in the political realm as well. I think sometimes people aren't really sure what is even meant by politics or government / politics / policy. So thinking about or referencing those types of situations that they're confronted with maybe can help be a little bit of a primer for getting involved in policymaking. Bill, would you like to take a crack at this, given having been such a long time leader up on Capitol Hill in the Senate, and having to work with folks who could be subject matter experts, but not really be clued in on the politics and the elements of that really can have major impacts on policy?
And you're right, it isn't just scientists, it's subject matter experts or people who just have strongly held policy beliefs will wonder, well, why can't we just do that best policy?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the job that one learns, if one's doing the job right, is that the job on Capitol Hill is something like a broker. The broker is trying to find the best possible policy result that can get the necessary votes and become law. And that can be very frustrating at times when our system, built as it was in the 18th century, makes it very difficult to get to a solution. But I like to think of what President Obama told Jerry Seinfeld once, that politics is a lot like football, because there's a lot of players, a lot of specialization, a lot of hitting. You hit the line, you get 1 yard. You try for a play, you get sacked. But every once in a while, you see a hole, and then there's open field, and that's when you get to enact a major piece of legislation.
Really exciting. Thanks for that metaphor. It's for sharing that. Really interesting and important for people to think about. As we wrap up, Emma, I'm wondering, almost back where we started, whether your parents hoped or expected that you'd go into government. You talked about elements of politics that are very much at play in the lab. So I'm wondering if you view your career choice as affecting policymaking at some point down the line, or even right now, perhaps.
Well, growing up, everybody, because we're right outside of DC, and most people, it feels like their parents are all working in government. They all said, "Oh, Emma, you'll be a wonderful lawyer one day. You're going to be such a great lawyer." I think that it is. I use those communication skills that a lawyer would use, reading and writing and talking, and I think that those are all skills that are very required of scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very glad that I made the decision to take that feedback and channel it into science. My parents were incredibly supportive in this decision. And when I told them that I was interested in science in my science classes, because that's the exposure that I had growing up, they said, "Well, we live down the street from the National Institutes of Health, so you should try to get an internship there." And they were very supportive in helping me to really accomplish all of these scientific landmarks. So I think that I'm not a huge disappointment to them. Going into the future, you never know. People's careers change so many times throughout their lifetimes these days. So anything is possible. You can always make a career transition, and being a STEM PhD does not exclude you from any other career decisions, and vice versa. Anyone can become a STEM PhD.
Thank you for that. Bill, anything to add?
Yep. As I said, I've known people who, despite having a doctorate in chemistry, became the deputy director of the National Economic Council. It's possible.
Well, you both bring such stimulating and meaningful perspectives to this topic, and I know that listeners are really going to enjoy this very special episode. I'm honored that you both come on the show together, and just want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks again for having us, Mark, and best wishes for every continued success in your podcast as well as in your consulting work.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that, Bill. All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.